Hello, my name is Byron Bridges. You just saw two videos, one in which a woman was explaining English while using ASL, and another of a person typing on a teletypewriter and signing at the same time. Both of these are examples of bilingualism. Bilingualism is an interesting topic. People who are not deaf define this as being able to easily transition between two languages. Now, we'll compare that to how people in the deaf community define bilingualism.
Bilingualism means people who are equally skilled in American Sign Language and spoken English.
Bilingualism means that a person has learned two different languages. It typically depends on where someone has grown up. There are a few examples of how people can become bilingual. One example might be that the languages between work and home may be different, or if someone moves to a new place and learns a new language over there, they will still continue to use their native language back home with their family. Another example may be that the languages between school and home are different as well. My final example is if someone marries into a family that speaks a different language at home, they now learn a new language from that family by interacting that way.
Bilingualism means using two languages. I am equally skilled in both Mexican Sign Language and American Sign Language. I can easily transition between the two languages. When signing in America, I use American Sign Language, and when I am signing in Mexico, I use Mexican Sign Language. When I'm with my relatives, I use Mexican Sign Language. When I'm with my friends, I transition back to American Sign Language. This is an example of how I am bilingual.
Bilingualism means I'm fluent in American Sign Language as well as writing and reading in English. When using ASL, it involves me socializing, interacting with people, and having political discussions. When using English, it involves me reading the newspaper, completing homework assignments, writing sentences, and so on. That's English. The fact that I can ease between both of these languages with proficiency makes me bilingual.
What does bilingualism mean? For me, it means that I can understand both American Sign Language and spoken English. I am a non-deaf interpreter. I am able to hear spoken English and produce the message in ASL and vice versa. I can see American Sign Language and produce the message in spoken English.
It's interesting to see how the deaf community describes bilingualism as knowing ASL and English, whereas people who aren't deaf describe it as knowing English as well as other languages, such as Spanish and French. Both groups agree that being bilingual means being able to transition between different languages. There seems to be similarities between the two perspectives. Now we'll see how these groups of people became bilingual.
To start, I was born deaf and was the only deaf person in my family. Until the age of 17, I was skilled in English and didn't know what sign language was. I could speak and write in complete English sentences. In college, so around the age of 17, I was introduced to the deaf world and how they used American Sign Language to communicate. I was amazed by it, completely taken back by the language just by watching it. I started to learn American Sign Language and study it. I completely dove into the language. It took me 10 years to realize how important American Sign Language really is and for me to find myself in who I really am. Being skilled in both English and American Sign Language was nice. It was nice looking back and realizing I didn't know one language. I knew American Sign Language and English. I also learned some Italian Sign Language and Quebec Sign Language. I think it's nice to know more than one language, maybe even 3 or 4 different languages.
Let me give you an example of what I think bilingualism means. I was born in Australia, where we had our own national language, which was Auslan Sign Language that all the deaf people use for communication. I had deaf parents and deaf family. I was born and raised in Australia, and I saw all of my family using Auslan Sign Language growing up. But growing up, I didn't know any English, but I remember how I started learning how to navigate between two different languages. I know that when I was growing up, if I wanted something, all I had to do was point to it. My mom would give it to me and use the sign for yes, which means the letters Y-E-S in a different language. but she would use the sign yes, and then I could get whatever it is I wanted. Later on, I went to my aunt's house. She's very good at determining the right situations to teach me certain things. I wanted an apple, so I thought, well, I'd better ask her first. So I asked her, can I get an apple? My aunt spelled the letters Y-E-S, and I just looked at her and I was totally caught off guard. What is Y-E-S? I asked her what that meant. Y-E-S, what does that mean? That's when she explained that the letters Y-E-S means the same thing as the sign for yes. I looked at her in awe and I asked her, so can I get an apple? And then she signed yes. As I proceeded to get my apple, that's when I realized the letters Y-E-S in English means yes in sign language. The sign for yes means Y-E-S in English. As I was eating my apple, I kept thinking about it and started to catch on. Since I started residential school, I started learning more and more English and going back and forth between Auslan Sign Language and English, and then I finally started to understand the connection between them. Since I arrived here in America, I've had to learn a different sign language, American Sign Language, so now I'm learning my third language.
I was brought up with bilingualism ever since growing up in a deaf family. I started out signing with my small little hands with my family until the day I was officially sent to school. I was excited to go, and when I started my first day, I noticed that my teacher was speaking while she was signing slowly. It looked like inadequate signing to me, but I understood a little bit of it. When I looked around at all the other kids signing that way also, but much faster and more complicated, it kind of scared me and looked like a bunch of nonsense. My teacher kept slowly signing and speaking at the same time every day during class, and I gradually picked up English. During class, I was supposed to copy down what I signed onto paper to practice and learn English. The teacher would also write on the board what we were supposed to write in English from what we were signing, but mine still looked a little bit different from what she was writing on the board. Then, when I went back home, all excited to show my parents my new signs that I had learned from school, they became upset and frustrated and told me that I was signing incorrectly. So I had to change the way that I was signing between home and school on a regular basis just to fit in with everyone.
I grew up in Mexico using Mexican Sign Language. When I was 8 years old, I moved to America and went to a school for the deaf. In class, when fingerspelling, I would use an ñ. The teacher corrected me by telling me that ñs are used in Mexican Sign Language and that n's are used in American Sign Language. It was then that I understood that there were two languages.
I remember learning my first language, which is ASL. Up until I was 3 years old, I did not have a language. My parents couldn't communicate with me. They tried, but I didn't understand. I was all over the place. I was around 3 years old when a deaf couple came up to me. They noticed that I was deaf as well. They tried to teach me how to sign. At first, I was a little confused, but then I caught on. I learned a variety of signs, asked a bunch of questions, and before you know it, I was proficient. When I was around 4 years old, I entered a deaf program at my preschool. That's where I learned English, which is my second language. Pictures, books, and focusing on English words taught me this. I understood what the alphabet looked like and that it was a part of English. But I used sign language to socialize. For example, talking to teachers and playing outside. Today, I can move between these languages with proficiency.
I grew up as a native English user. All of a sudden, at the age of about 18 or 19 years old, I became interested in sign language courses. I was slowly starting to use sign language and understand it. Later on, I took more courses and started improving. About 2 or 3 years ago, I became a certified interpreter. I continued to learn, but now I sign well.
So how do deaf people and people who aren't deaf become bilingual? People who are not deaf become bilingual by listening to different languages, whereas deaf people acquire different languages visually. The experiences between these two groups of people are different. Now let's look at how they use bilingualism in their everyday lives.
Normally, I would start every morning by reading the newspaper, which is in written English. When I read something interesting, my roommate and I would discuss it in American Sign Language. Then I would go to class and read and write in English, and in class, we would normally discuss things in American Sign Language. That's how I use my bilingualism every day.
I have 2 languages I use every day. For example, I grew up in Australia. The deaf people in Australia use their national language, ASL Sign Language. There in Australia, they use TTYs, and to use those, you have to use English to type on them. Just like people all over read newspapers, which are in English, and they're able to read and write in English. Deaf people in Australia use sign language to communicate, so they swap back and forth between English and ASL Sign Language. If more people from Australia came here to America, it would be sort of awkward and difficult for them to become proficient in a third language, such as American Sign Language. Right now, I'm here in America learning 2 languages, American Sign Language and English. I'm learning to read and write in English, read newspapers, create sentences, and things like that. If a friend of mine from Australia came here to visit America, I'd be able to navigate back and forth between American Sign Language and ASL Sign Language, which is called interpreting. I would explain things using ASL Sign Language to my friend. And if my friend wanted to talk to another deaf person here in America, I would use American Sign Language with the American deaf person, and then interpret using ASL Sign Language for my friend from Australia, just like I would interpret using American Sign Language for the deaf person from America, and keep switching back and forth since I'm proficient in both languages.
I use bilingualism every day. For example, watching TV with the captions on is using English because I read it and I have no problem understanding it. Sometimes my friends will have problems understanding what the English captions say, and so I explain it to them using ASL. I am able to read the English captions and interpret them for someone else from English into ASL because I am fluent in both languages.
Yes, I use sign language every day. For example, in class, when the teacher hands out homework in English and I am unsure of what the teacher wants us to do, I ask my classmates for help and we discuss the assignment in American Sign Language. After discussing it in American Sign Language, everything becomes clear. Then I sit at the computer and type my homework in English.
Yes, I naturally use bilingualism every day. When I go to restaurants with my friends, we sit down and we read the menu, which is English. We discuss what we like on the menu in ASL. Once we're finished discussing, the server comes over to take our order. I point out what I want on the menu. If the server does not understand me, I write down my order in English on a piece of paper and give it to them.
How do you use both languages? In the past, I taught an English class to deaf students. I would write English sentences on the chalkboard and explain the sentences to my students in American Sign Language until they understood. They would begin to distinguish between English and American Sign Language. Their skills for both languages improved.
Deaf people and people who are not deaf use language differently. People who are not deaf can transition between languages while they're speaking, talking on the phone, and other ways. Deaf people use a teletypewriter by taking ASL and typing it into English. A sentence in English looks different compared to how it looked in ASL. As you can see, these 2 groups of people use language in different ways, but they have similar perspectives of what it means to be bilingual. Next, we'll see examples of how deaf people who are bilingual sign in their native language. This is truly fascinating. I hope you learned from the people in the video about bilingualism and that language can be used in different ways. The goal of this video was to teach people what it means when you know more than one language, and to encourage people to learn more languages. Some people are worried about their deaf children acquiring language. But this video proves that deaf people can be bilingual or even trilingual. I hope to encourage more parents with deaf children to study language and support the movement of bilingualism. Thank you.